on the assembly of the plant and giving it the manufacturer's name of the American Bridge Company.
The Pittsburgh-based American Bridge Company was able to employ the practice of building from either bank using a cantilever principle. It was necessary to stabilize the eye-bars in each arm with additional diagonal braces until, that is, the two arms met and the whole structure became independently stable. Each eye-bar cluster was, of course, clearly specified in the engineering plans.
This sheet here shows you the assembly of the eye bar and the number of bars that are in the assembly which the pin goes through.
The pinning, or threading, was itself a difficult undertaking because of the tight tolerance between the pin and the eye bar holes. The material used was standard annealed mild steel, which is susceptible to corrosion, like many steels. Also, each eye bar contained high levels of tensile residual stress from the manufacturing process, and that residual stress could be significant at the points where the eye holes were drilled out. A combination of tensile stress, a material like mild steel, and the corrosive environment of a bridge exposed to the elements and industrial pollution can lead to stress corrosion cracking. So incorporating more material in the form of multiple eye bars makes the overall design of the bridge safer against factors such as these. The construction engineers in Pittsburgh knew what they were doing and could rely on their own tried and tested expertise. At this time, the American Bridge Company also went on to construct both the Silver and High Carpenter bridges. However, those bridges were engineered by a different designer, who embraced a new high-strength, high-carbon, heat-treated steel, which, presumably, he thought meant that you could build a less substantial structure. Undoubtedly, he expected lower live loading than in Pittsburgh. But each bridge was a much longer span, and so the loads at the tops of the chains in the towers would have been greater than in the bridges in Pittsburgh. The towers themselves were less substantial structures as well. Yet, the designer felt sufficiently confident in the new material to proceed. The new design did have a safety factor of 1.5 when they were built, but that didn't account for the increasing weight and amount of traffic that each bridge would carry, as cars and lorries were to become heavier and more prevalent with time. Jack Fowler, a resident of Point Pleasant at the time of the disaster, now runs the local museum.
The new bridge, of course, it was owned by local people, and they publicized and promoted it as a very high-strength material bridge. So the residents had no reason not to doubt that it was not going to be a nice, strong bridge, similar, though thinner in design, not the big chunky bridge that existed in some of the other areas, but they had complete confidence in it. And this nice silver shiny bridge that we had here, people loved it. And throughout the 39 years of existence, people had pride in the Silver Bridge.
Following the Silver Bridge collapse, it was imperative to identify the cause precisely and identify the safety-critical parts of the structure. The big problem facing the investigators was that 90% of the bridge was submerged in fast-flowing river.
The next day, people came from every place, the state, the federal government, Ohio, West Virginia. They had crews in here, the National Guard, and they were out trying to drag and recover bodies, and they were bringing in the Corps of Engineer derricks, boats, to start removing the steel. Well, after they recovered bodies, they wanted to reconstruct the bridge, and as they pulled pieces out, they numbered them, marked them, and then they took them and laid them all out in a field to try to find the culprit. What happened? Where was the failure? When they recovered the 330 I-bar, when they found the two pieces, that's when they started realizing that one of those must have fractured and separated or blew apart and caused the failure. So they focused on that. And I think from the investigation, that appears to be what happened. That's the analysis that we received about the failure. And that's the one we promote and talk about here at the museum.
Most of the material that was recovered from the scene is long gone, but the museum did save at least a sample of an eye-bar assembly, albeit one that has been cleaned and painted to look like new.
This is a typical eye-bar joint from the Silver Bridge, which was rescued after the disaster. It comprises a central pin over which the eye bars would have been pivoted. And the whole assembly is encapsulated by the very solid end caps, which themselves are attached by 1-inch bolts through the center of the pin. There's some interesting evidence of pitting corrosion on the bearing surfaces. This would be the bearing surface of the pin over which the eye bars would rotate. And there is considerable pitting under the track of one of the outer eye bars, and also underneath the cap. Even deeper corrosion pitting caused during its lifetime on the bridge itself.
So, what were the weather conditions on that evening of December the 15th, 1967? And how was the bridge being used at the time?
The weather was kind of chilly. There was snow flurries coming, and it was getting dark. It was around, it was time when everyone was getting off of work in the evening time.
Traffic lights on a bridge change the patterns, the traffic flow. Once it changes, then you've got all the traffic that's backed up, and they come, a wave of them rush across the bridge, and whatever's in that line, that's the load that you're going to get at that time. And it was on both sides, and it would work both ways. Because, so as you can tell from our model, that there was a great many coming through from that last change of light in Point Pleasant.
When there was heavy traffic on the bridge, there was a motion of going up and down, but I was told that that was normal. So I wasn't afraid of the bridge.
The bridge, I don't think anyone ever crossed it that they didn't feel movement. That was a discussion of the community, of the area, because there was always swaying. It had the up and down motion from so much weight on it, and everybody always said, well, this bridge is going to fall someday. But then you look back at the design. It was a different design, and we felt that it because of the design, it had that built-in motion, so to speak. So you talked about it, but did you worry about it? No, but the motion was there. We experienced that personally.
This is where the bearing surface would connect with the pin, and it's from roughly a position at right angles to the shank of the bar where the critical brittle crack, which brought the bridge down, actually started. On the inner bearing surface, there's extensive pitting corrosion, very similar to the one on the corresponding part of the pin, and also traces of fretting marks caused by particles of rust wearing away the surface as the bearing moved.
The eye bar that failed, number 330, was positioned on the Ohio end of the bridge on its northern side. Back at the West Virginia end, Charlene Wood was approaching in her car. But with the failure of that eye bar, she was heading into trouble.
As I stopped, the bridge was coming forward like dominoes, swaying back and forth. The tower went to the north when it fell. And as I was seeing all this, unbelievably, didn't know what was really happening. I did know what was happening, but it just hadn't registered yet.
So what did the forensic investigation conclude had happened to make the bridge fall? Well, eye bar 330 was defective because it had particularly high levels of residual stress left after its manufacture. The design of the eye bar assembly meant that water could pool at the bottom of the eye hole, and the combination of the tensile residual stress and a corrosive environment had caused a stress corrosion crack to form. Hidden away, the crack had grown slowly over 39 years until it was about 3 millimeters long. Also, the steel used in the eye bars had a low toughness at the near freezing temperatures on the night of the disaster, making it susceptible to brittle fracture. Under a combination of the high live loading on the bridge and the reduced toughness of the steel, the relatively small crack caused a brittle fracture of the eye bar. At the point of failure, a brittle crack grew almost instantaneously down to the outer edge. This overloaded the upper side, which separated with some signs of ductility. The resulting asymmetric load on the pin caused it to twist, and the single eye bar that was left vibrated off the other side of the pin, at which point the chain was completely severed. The adjacent tower, being destabilized, started toppling and fell to the north. The road below twisted over, and the other tower was pulled down into the river as well.
What we thought about after the event was how it was inspected, and if it was and you found something, then what do you do to replace it? How do you get in here and replace one of these eye bars or one of the joints if something was corrosion or you found failure in? How do you go about replacing that? But I guess that the people at the time had so much confidence in the process of this new high-strength steel that there wasn't a fear. And I'm sure they built in factors, but we found out later that it wasn't as purported to be.
Following in the wake of the Silver Bridge disaster, one immediate legacy was that the High Carpenter Bridge was closed.
The sister bridge had to be closed because it was a similar design. The same company built it. We know now that they knew that there wasn't any way to inspect it and to correct any findings that they might have. So public opinion almost required that bridge be closed to vehicular traffic.
So I sneaked through the bars of the barrier and walked across the bridge, and the people that were waiting to get some way to cross, they just followed me like little chicks following a mother hen, and there were just a trail of us pedestrians. But Dick asked me, he said, aren't you afraid to cross the bridge, just to show you how the people were affected by that, the falling of the Silver Bridge, that they thought that bridge could fall at any time.
I suppose a case could be made for not having closed the St. Mary's Bridge as soon as they did. It had different use. It didn't have the traffic lights at the end. It didn't have the interstate traffic that our bridge had here, the tractor trailers, all the heavy loads that it carried. There could have been means of inspecting to find if there was failure on the bridge, if it could be used in a different manner. But I believe that public opinion would not have accepted that. There was too much pressure because of this terrible disaster we had here. I think public opinion would have overridden whatever they may have found.
They couldn't get it out of their minds. The fate of this bridge was sealed. The National Transportation Safety Board had no other recourse than to say they had to condemn the bridge because they couldn't prove it was safe. And they were no doubt right in coming to that conclusion.
So, apart from the subsequent demolition and removal of the High Carpenter Bridge, the Silver Bridge disaster did at least have a lasting legacy in terms of bridge safety in general.
When the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967, President Johnson established National Bridge Inspection Standards, which are the guidelines that are used throughout the United States for all bridges that are inspected. The National Bridge Inspection Standards require that every bridge be inspected on a 2-year frequency, and if that bridge has any problems, it's increased to 12 months, or it could be once a month depending on how severe the problems are with that structure.
The 3 sister bridges have already been inspected over 20 times, and they will continue to be checked for safety.
In the past, the designers had designed this bridge to last 100 years with a factor of safety around 2, and due to the heavy loads that are traveling across the bridge today, that factor of safety has probably gone down but it's still a safe bridge to travel. To replace these particular I-bars, because they're in tension, you'd have to design another support system to support it while you're removing it. So you'd actually build some false work. It would be another bridge next to the exact same bridge that you have, and then remove that false work when you're all complete. The different techniques that we use to inspect the steel members would be non-destructive testing, where we can x-ray the metal, or we can use a sonogram, where you use a gel over top of the metal with a sound probe. In the near future, we're going to make some minor repairs to hold us over until we have time to develop plans for a major rehab on the bridge. In that major rehab, we're going to replace the deck and all the steel members that are deteriorated and paint the structure over again.
In America alone, there are over 1 million bridges, and thanks to Silverbridge, they all now receive regular inspection and maintenance. In the case of the three sister bridges, redundancy was built in from the outset in the form of additional I-bars, reducing the criticality of highly stressed joints. It's just as important today for those engineers responsible for designing and maintaining bridges to be aware of the need for redundancy, where the inevitable weakest links occur in a structure. And also, knowing those weakest links to protect them from the effects of corrosion and fatigue, and thus ensure the integrity of the structure.
This is Scotland's fourth largest city and was once the richest city in Europe. Sitting on the banks of the Firth of Tay, it's a city of discovery. Famous for its whaling, its jute, jam and journalism. Oh, and not forgetting Desperate Dan and Oor Willie. The railway bridge travels more than 2 miles over the Firth of Tay, and the River Tay discharges 207,000 cubic feet of water per minute. The River Tay is the longest river in Scotland, the 7th longest river in Britain, and the largest river in the UK by volume of discharge. I'm here in Dundee, and behind me is the second railway bridge to be built over the Firth of Tay. The first bridge collapsed, killing 75 people, including the designer's son-in-law. The only survivor, the locomotive. But what caused the longest railway bridge in the world to collapse during a fearful storm? And the answer is not as simple as designer error. The Tay Bridge was opened on the 1st of June 1878. It was the longest railway bridge in the world and a dream come true for its designer Thomas Bouch. He had been obsessed for years to build a railway bridge over the Tay. He was a well-known railway engineer, designing many railways and stations within Scotland. Even railway ferries had Thomas Bouch's engineering skills. Queen Victoria was not at the opening of the bridge, but in late June 1879 she crossed the bridge on her way back to Windsor. Thomas Bouch was presented to the Queen at Dundee, and on the 27th of June he was sent to Windsor, where he received a knighthood. On the evening of the 28th of December 1879, Dundee was suffering storm force winds, its worst storm in its history. roofs were being blown off, chimneys were falling, and full railway wagons of coal were moving in marshalling yards simply with the strength of the wind. It was a tiring trip for the passengers between Granton Pier and Burn Island on the ferry. The storm was only hours away and the crossing fairly quiet. Men, women and children travelling back from their Christmas festivities. The 5:20 train from Burn Island to Dundee consisted of 4 third-class coaches, 1 second, 1 first, a brake van and locomotive. The train stopped at St Fort Station, then stopped at Wormit signal box for its token. Next destination, the bridge. This is the grim view the people of Dundee witnessed the following morning. 75 people dead. But there was reports to the people of Dundee that there could have been as many as 300 people on the train. And this is a famous painting of a gentleman called James Roberts. He was a locomotive foreman in Dundee, and him and his friend James Smith attempted on the evening when the train disappeared to walk across the bridge to find out why. James Smith stopped short because of the wind, and James Roberts carried on, only to find the gap. At 19:15, on the 28th of December 1879, the central navigation girders of the longest railway bridge in the world collapsed into the River Tay during a violent storm. News travelled quickly to the North British Railway headquarters in Edinburgh via telegraph. A telegram was sent to the designer Sir Thomas Bouch. He was in bed, alone, and nobody knows his reaction. But he was invited to catch a special train to Dundee to witness the worst engineering disaster of its time. As Dundee and the local villages on the banks of the Tay were busy looking for survivors and the wreckage of the train, an investigation was put into motion by the Board of Trade as soon as the news of this catastrophe reached London. 3 commissioners were appointed to consider the evidence. They proceeded with haste, knowing the whole country looked at them for an explanation for this engineering disaster. The following morning, before breakfast, Mr. Gibb, the postmaster, hurried through the streets to the Provost House with a telegram. It was from Sir Henry Ponsonby. "Can you give me any particulars of this appalling calamity reported to have taken place? The Queen is inexpressibly shocked and feels most deeply for those who have lost friends and relatives in this terrible accident." In his dressing gown, unshaven, his eyes dry from a night without sleep, Provost Brownie wrote in his reply, telling Sir Henry all he knew, all that he believed. He followed the official statement made by the North British Railway, that it deeply regrets to say that nearly 300 passengers, beside the company's servants, were in the train. So until station agent Robert Morris came over from St Fort Station, the city was grieving 300 deads. In his pocket, Morris carried 57 tickets, which his staff had collected. He remembered 2 season ticket holders, and remembered 7 or 11 passengers had retained their tickets. The sum was simple and quickly done. Provost Brownlee announced the loss of 75 men, women and children. But who were they? What were their names? Where did they live? And weirdly, the Provost asked Station Master Smith to make discreet inquiries amongst the waiting crowd. Sir Thomas Bouch arrived into Dundee by special train on Monday morning. He was accompanied by his son, They would be unaware as they passed Taybridge Station that its large refreshment rooms had been transferred and cleared for the reception of the dead. He met Provost Brownlee and Harbour Master Robertson. Sir Thomas asked if he could visit his bridge as soon as possible. He was told the steamer the Forfarshire would be leaving Dundee Harbour at 10 o'clock. As Sir Thomas saw his fallen bridge, he held on to his son's arm. And all around were small ships, searching for survivors or bodies. Just before sunset, on the Monday evening after the disaster, northeast of Tayport, 3 miles from the bridge, a muzzle dredger had seen a dark shape drifting between 2 sandbanks. It was the first body of a middle-aged woman. The body was taken to Dundee's Taybridge Station and laid on a wagon sheet in the refreshment room. There was nothing in her pockets to identify her apart from a railway ticket to Broughty Ferry. It was the body of Anne Cruikshanks, a housemaid to Lady Baxter of Kilmarron, an ordinary woman who had ended an uneventful life by being the first body to be removed from the Taybridge disaster. The inquiry team set up by the Board of Trade and sitting in Dundee Courthouse held an initial session lasting several days, starting on Saturday, the 3rd of January 1880. The 3 members, chaired by Mr. Rothery, Commissioner of Recs, the others were Colonel Yolans, the Inspector of Railways, and Mr. W.H. Barlow, President of the Institute of Civil Engineers, and a distinguished practicing civil engineer. The second part of the inquiry was devoted for the analyst of the disaster. There was 3 engineers appointed, Mr. Henry Law for the inquiry, and Dr. William Pole and Mr. Alan Stewart acting on behalf of the North British Railway. In addition, Mr. Law collected samples of the column material and wrought iron samples, bolts and struts for mechanical testing, as well as many broken parts as could be shown at the exhibit of the inquiry. He asked Mr. David Kirkcaldy to test the samples using a hydraulic tensometer. A photographer was appointed by the commissioners from a local firm called Valentine's of Dundee, later to become famous for its picture postcards. The 50 photographs were taken of the remains of the bridge about a week after it collapsed. These photographs were vital evidence of the way the bridge collapsed, and were of remarkably high quality. So far there'd only been 1 body removed from the Tay, that of Anne Cruikshanks. She was found in the northeast just off Tayport, a housemaid to Lady Baxter. But there was a rumour going round Dundee that she had been murdered in Edinburgh and brought to Tayport and dumped in the Tay. But the police found this was not true. She was travelling with Elsa Smart, a table maid, aged 24, and that was Anne Cruikshanks' niece. She'd been travelling with her fiancé George Johnson, but they all died in the train. With Dundee trying to come to terms with this terrible disaster, the church ministers had their say. God determined to guard his Sabbath with jealous care. By travelling on a train on the Sabbath, the body still floating somewhere in the Tay, they knew they had been transgressing from God's law. By this time, the North British Railway Company would pay £5 per body found. And all clothing and belongings found along the beaches of the Tay were taken to Taybridge Station's refreshment room, where they were laid out on tables, hoping that relatives may identify some of the belongings. The people of Dundee were now concerned that no bodies had been found except for that of Anne Cruikshanks. And the whaling fishermen started a rumour that bodies may start to float to the surface after 7 or 8 days. and the only reason Anne Cruikshanks's body had been found, it just so happened to float onto a sandbank. Anne's funeral was on a Thursday after the disaster. She was mourned by the whole of Dundee. Great crowds followed her hearse. She once again travelled over the Tay and was laid to rest in Fife. On Wednesday the 31st of December, Diver Simpson found the locomotive. It was encased in one of the central navigation high girders. You can see in this drawing there was more than just the engine. There was 5 carriages and the brake van, and they were found all encased in the girders. By now there had been a relief fund set up to help the victims. It stood at £1,980 and 16 shillings. Monies include £500 given from the North British Railway Company, £500 from individual subscriptions from directors of companies. But there was also a banker's draft cheque for £250, signed by Thomas Bouch. On the Tuesday morning of the 8th day, the whalers, the fishermen, the mussel dredgers continued the search on the Tay for bodies. They were hoping that the whalers would be correct with the fact that bodies after the 8th day would rise to the surface. And later, they were right. But that afternoon, there was a cry from the river. "A body!" The crowd who had gathered in Taybridge Station rushed down to the quayside. One man who had been helping searching for bodies was that of Andrew Johnston. He was the brother of guard David Johnston. When he heard that a body had been found, he rushed back to Taybridge Station. The body that was found was that of a man. It was taken to Taybridge Station and laid on the table. Relatives walked past slowly, seeing if they could identify him. Then Andrew Johnston walked past the body and did not move. It was his brother, guard David Johnston. His body was not disfigured. His face looked natural and placid. He had blood coming from his left ear. His fists were clenched. He had £1.13 and 6 pennies in his pockets of his uniform, and his silver watch had stopped at 1916. Andrew, still weeping, went to find his brother's widow. 4 more bodies were found that day, and the following day the body of John Marshall was found 400 yards from the southern Broken Pier. He had no next of kin, so was identified by the station master. His face was badly burnt and had 2 deep wounds in his head. He was the fireman stoker. By the end of January, 33 bodies had been discovered, men, women and children. The driver's body, David Marshall, was washed up 9 weeks later. 46 bodies found, 29 still missing. 29 bodies never found. It was clear to the inquiry that the original designs had been changed by Thomas Bouch. Stone pillars had been changed to iron columns. The bridge high girders were not fixed to the base. They sat on roller bearings for expansion. There was even a suggestion at the Wanbet Foundry that staff found imperfections in the iron girders, and they used a substance called Beaumont egg, which is like beeswax and iron filings mixed, to cover the imperfections and then painting it black so nobody would know. The maximum speed of the bridge was 25 miles an hour, but some passengers giving evidence suggested trains were travelling as fast as 45 miles an hour. This could have weakened the structure. During high winds in the construction of the centre high girders, one collapsed in the high winds and was reused, not replaced. When the locomotive was found, they found the regulator fully opened, which would suggest that the driver and the crew on the footplates didn't see the disaster coming. The train and the girders just fell from the bridge. As I said earlier, the only survivor of the Tay Bridge disaster was its engine. It was sent back to Cowlairs in Glasgow, refitted and returned into service for another 45 years. And the drivers named it